Welcome to Magus Wisdom Now, the new name for the channel formerly known as the Esoteric Survivalist. In this second installment of our discussion on the sacred fire, we will talk about the mistakes that can make this potent evolutionary force turn against you, and how not only to avoid them, but to harness the nature of the fire for maximum benefit. The fire is called sacred for a reason, yet there are wrongful practices and attitudes that can turn a blessing into a curse. The result is a form of burnout from which it is very difficult to recover depending on the details, the individual, and how far the crisis itself has progressed. Like any psychosomatic condition, a little prevention is all you need, whereas seeking cures is a far more challenging endeavor. Like any fire, this sacred flame needs to be approached with respect and a balanced frame of awareness. Add to this, we are not only cautioned from the fire getting out of control, but it must be sustained artfully so that our emotional reactions and the proverbial dark night of the soul doesn't suffocate it. That problem is not as acute as overstimulation and having the fire immolate our psychic being. And so artful engagement is not as difficult as it may sound. In the discussion that follows, we will give examples of excess and then supply the information needed to not only avoid esoteric immolation and burnout and the psychic stress resulting from it, but we will explain how to keep the inner fire alive and evolving toward greater purity as we allow it to work on us in a healthy and empowering manner. So let's get to it. In modern terms, when the fire goes out of control, the individual is said to undergo spiritual crisis. In its more extreme forms, this crisis can lead to symptoms that resemble psychosis. In alchemy, the situation is constrained and controlled in a process called calcination that involves the fire reducing our current psychic makeup to a base state, much like ash, that is then processed in various ways through the work. And it is essentially transmuted and reabsorbed as something evolved, purified, and empowering. The treasure of alchemy, essentially. But this is not what we're talking about now. We don't have to complicate things to that degree, as we shall see. Suffice it to say that the proverbial dark night of the soul is meant to be a temporary state if we allow certain procedures that happen to be outlined in the Yoga Sutras to be applied conscientiously. One of the more popularized expressions of this fire is associated with the force known as Kundalini Shakti in Sanskrit. But I'm speaking about this generally, so we're not going to nitpick what the difference between the flame and Kundalini is and life force and things like that. But this power is said to be coiled at the base of the spine, and with the right stimulus, it can be activated to fill the body and the mind and result in enlightenment and the attainment of psychic powers and abilities. We will not be getting into the Kundalini aspect of the sacred fire at this stage either, but as an advanced method of the misapplications that cause its unhealthy side and make this fire our worst enemy, these are usually described within the framework of this concept. Many people meditate, for example, using techniques that stimulate the Kundalini energy through the sacred fire, and all of the descriptions are framed in that manner. So, because these are the easiest descriptions to find, I will only give 4 examples of what happens when this fire is wrongly addressed and applied. And I will explain what these wrongful actions and attitudes are that warp the experience into something we would be very smart to avoid. There are many who have regretted getting into mystical practices because of their negative experiences with the fire. While even those who have managed to recover from the ordeal and even attain progress in their esoteric work, they still wish they knew better. To this end, I will provide 3 examples of misapplication. And I will also give you a 4th example where spiritual crisis was stimulated instinctively to burn out negativity. So the fire itself is not against us. It is not a bad thing. However, when we do not engage with it with enough reverence, respect, and with enough precautions, then it can seem that it is a negative thing. Instead, it is our lack of readiness and a certain unhealthy state of awareness, an unhealthy state of the psyche that brings about these misapplications. Now, the first example I'm going to give is a well known one. It is that of Gopi Krishna, who was a man living in the province of Kashmir, India, around the first quarter of the last century. This man meditated for about 12 years on his veranda or on his terrace. Um, and he would focus on his crown center above his head and practice this meditation for an hour to 2 hours every day. I'm not sure of the details, but after 12 years, he had a profound experience of going out of his body, of experiencing a rush of waters in his ears, and a light went up his spine into his head and blew him into a state of extreme ecstasy. And he wanted to sustain that state. So he came back from it and he tried to do it again. However, the second and the third time, the fire was not so pleasant. There wasn't ecstasy, there was pain. And for 12 years after this, he suffered from states of psychosis, internal agony, burning inside. The situation is well documented in his own work, and you can look it up. When he wrote to a well known yogi, Sri Aurobindo, around the mid 30s, he was advised that the energy went up the wrong channel. It's supposed to go up either up the spine or the middle pillar of the body and to be balanced at the center of the head. However, in his case, it went up the right side and stimulated just the right channel and got stuck there. And because he kept focusing that in such a manner, he couldn't change it. Eventually, over time, he reached a state where he was just crying out for help. It was that stressful for him. And suddenly the fire itself lifted and went up the left channel and balanced things out. Now, the left channel is more like a cooling force, whereas the right channel is a heating force. So the fire wasn't constrained, but it transformed into a more balanced aspect. And then everything equalized. From what I understand, Krishna explained how the fire increased his intelligence. And it wasn't so much psychic powers, but intuition and creativity. It would seem that he didn't get the benefits that he could have gotten if he didn't have this crisis, that some damage was done. And even though he recovered from it to become more than he was before, the effort and the pain he underwent did take their toll. Now, this is the first thing. When you do engage in the inner focus, the passionate focus that stimulates this sacred fire, usually you would do so in a frame of mind that is the one you use in everyday life. Krishna was working as a public servant and he was dealing with numbers and concepts and basically with what you might call the left brain. And the left brain rules the right side of the body. So if his focus wasn't already balanced toward the more intuitive side, of course his attention would have hyperstimulated one hemisphere and one side of his nervous system as a result. So imbalance is one of the causes of misapplication of the sacred fire. If you are too logical, if you are essentially a very structured person, very analytical, and you shun the intuitive side, then I would suggest you stay away from these practices unless you begin working the other side of yourself. Similarly, if you are intuitive, emotional, hypersensitive, and prone to depression, you can stimulate just the left side, and that would lead to a different effect. Same fire, but instead of burning you, it pulls you down too much. It almost seems like the fire itself is doused and too much of the lunar so called element, too much of the feminine receptive element. And that would make your willpower go down and your motivation go down, and you would be prone more to depression, which is what may happen to many people unbeknownst to them. Now, the next two examples I'm going to give are examples that I found on the internet years ago and that left an impression on. The first one is pretty brief. It's about a young man, and he was just talking in there about his own experience where he would chant the Gayatri mantra, which is considered a very benevolent mantra, but he was also hyper focused on it and very ambitious and wanted enlightenment now. And so he kept chanting and chanting this while he was focusing very strongly with an almost violent sense of youthful will. And eventually he would increase the rhythm of the mantra. He would tone it faster and faster and faster until it became toned so fast that he almost couldn't understand it. And then that spiraled out of control in his own mind with symptoms similar to what Gopi Krishna experienced. Again, this is an imbalance, but it is more due to a sense of violent urgency, a lack of faith, a lack of receptivity, a lack of feedback. And so, if you're trying to force the fire, that's another way that it can turn on you. Do not be rushed in these processes. And faith is there for a reason, because patience is something that's organic in this work. It's not something forced, and it's not something that's infinite where you're tapping your foot and waiting for results. This is the patience that occurs as you get feedback from these processes. Now, the third example is different from the previous ones. This is a woman who used to engage in what they call sexual fetishes, where something like candle wax or a little bit of pain would lead her into states of ecstasy, physical ecstasy. And she was very sensitive in that manner. So then she practiced Kundalini yoga, or what she thought was that, and was stimulating this fire at the root of her spine. However, because of her sensitivity, her sense of feedback was very acute. And she kept pushing beyond her limits until she obtained states of ecstasy that she had attained when she was engaging in these physical fetishes. And she would do this again and again and again in an almost addictive manner, getting into so called ecstasy at will until she couldn't stop it. In her own words, from what I remember reading, she said, well, you would think that's a good thing, but it isn't. This is something many people want to attain, but once they have it and they can't stop, it actually turns into a form of distress. And it's not the kind of pain that she would engage in that was at the boundary line of pleasure. And this messed her up a lot to the point that she had to leave her job and go get a house somewhere with her savings and not even deal with people. She couldn't. And I never heard from her again outside of that post she made on this forum. And this was like over a decade ago that I read this, maybe 15 years. Who knows what happened? Now, the fourth state is what you might call that of shamanic emergency, where it wasn't caused by misapplication. It actually used the sacred fire to induce a state of fever to overcome the trauma of separation and grief. And so, someone who was in crisis because of a breakup and because this upset them so much that they were literally going into panic attacks and states that were almost psychotic, and no therapy could help or anything until one day when the thoughts in her head were going over and over and over again, the fire itself intervened seemingly and burned everything out. All of a sudden, she transitioned, similar to Gopi Krishna, from a state of acute distress into a state of profound peace. And this peace lasted for a while. It wasn't permanent, but it did give her a new foundation in life, something from where she could proceed because she was not engaged in spiritual practices per se, but it was almost like an initiation. So you might say that many crises endured by shamans are related to the sacred fire in the form of a kind of cleansing fever. So it isn't all bad, but it is not comfortable. Now, these states are not rare. The internet used to be full of them. There's another case of an individual who just practiced a little bit of yoga and underwent some kind of crisis. And he just practiced it and wasn't even interested in spiritual matters. So when you deal with the sacred fire, you need to respect it, if not revere it. It isn't a deity, but it is a part of our evolutionary potential, as Gopi Krishna wrote, that catalyzes the next step in our psychosomatic potential and empowerment. Now, one of the reasons behind crises like that is because the inner fire is treated as a mechanical phenomena rather than an organic and sacred one. The question we must ask ourselves here is, why am I engaging and with what am I engaging? Interestingly, I've hung around people in the proverbial drug scene, And the ones that ended up in crisis were usually going in blind, pushing the envelope of what the experience was offering them just because they had no true aspiration. Aspiration is another thing. You need this, you want this, you're drawn to this, this is who you are. The alchemists, on the other hand, the ones of a more spiritual or esoteric nature at least, advise constant prayer and communion with God, just as most esoteric practices are tied to the mysteries of religious revelations and that which is termed sacred. So these are not techniques that you act out off a script. And that's why, very reluctantly, I would say, do these 5 things as if you are reading off a menu. So, removing the sacred from the equation makes it profane, and profanity has always been deemed insulting or at least irreverent to the essence of the sacred flame and the divine essence behind that, which is our own true essence, mystically speaking. Now, there's another reason why the forces that should be leading to our actualization as whole and sacred being turned against us. The fire itself is a potential of the default healthy state of the human body mind, even though it's latent. When it's awakened, it must be first purified and refined. It's more accurate to say that we are the ones who need to be purified and refined before we start throwing gasoline upon our inner flame. So, in this perspective, we will bypass considerations involving elaborate rituals and methods of internal focus. We won't be talking about meditation. But let's go back to the Yoga Sutras, because I don't want to get into how to deal with the sacred flame in terms of anything that complicates things. We've already discussed what we need in order to make sure that we don't get burned. And the key is our mind, because our mind determines our level of focus and it also determines our quality of focus. So if we have unresolved issues of greed, and if we are engaging in this focus to gain powers for material gain, not that anything's wrong with material gain, but if that is our exclusive focus, then we can bypass the organic feedback. We won't listen to the small messages of how to artfully move this fire, because this fire may sound like an abstraction, but it is directly tied to the quality and power of our attention. As such, the fire, as we engage with it in the internalizations that we have discussed, known as niyamas, it is purified on its own through the next 2 aspects of internalization: self observation and study, and surrendering to the inner authority, which is as close as we can get to a divine dynamic. It's not religious per se, but there is always something greater than what we perceive as ourselves, something deeper. Our consciousness is unfathomable. It's like a great iceberg, only it doesn't have a bottom. It goes straight into the depths. And so from these depths, what emerges is a force that underlines our very being. And we can open ourselves to this force because it's benign. However, in order to open up to it, we must first focus on ourselves, understand ourselves, and orient the fire itself toward self observation. Mindfulness is not necessarily self observation, it's more of a passive state. And mindfulness on its own will not get you into the yogic frame, because the yogic frame, the procedure of yoga, is based on tying together the fire, the force of your internal passion, which stimulates it, with your sense of self as something that you sincerely want to open up to, and surrendering to the deeper levels, because you don't have conscious access to these. So you need to say, okay, here I am. This is me. This is my I am sense. But it's not a passive mindfulness thing. The sacred fire itself is a fire. It is passionate. It is intense. And at the same time, as we engage with it and open to the point of surrender to these higher forces or deeper forces or more essential forces, we are able to summon it. And the 3 processes are tied together. And as we feel these 3 processes tied together, they become one thing. And this one thing, one essence of being, so to speak, it's very hard to describe, even if it can be described, but it leads to what we call our stance. This is often conflated with physical stances, with physical postures, but it is actually a posture of awareness. Now, in order to tie all these 3 things together, we need to first have the first 2 internalizations, a sense of internal cleansing and cleanliness. Because when someone becomes sensitive, when they open up and abilities open up, they can be completely open to everything, positive and negative. They can become too empathic. So you're walking into a room and you're absorbing everybody else's negativity. Now, paradoxically, this will make everybody else probably feel better, but unconsciously, they may be seeing you as a human toilet, even if they're your best friends, because they do feel better around you. They're not aware of what they're doing, even if they are doing anything. I mean, you're the one who's open, and nature abhors a vacuum. And so, everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, even the good unprocessed from somebody can create stress within you. So, how do you prevent that? Well, let's go back again. The 5 externalizations that we've talked about, you can refer to the prior videos about the yamas and all of these externalization processes that seem like ethical behaviors, ethical conditioning, or morals. But integrity, a sense of genuine truthfulness, a lack of preconceptions, which leads to nonviolent behavior because you don't jump the gun. This leads to patience and your genuine behavior, a respect for boundaries, and a respect for your own boundaries and those of others. These are organic extrapolations, organic evolutions of the situation, leading to a sense of not grasping. So you're relaxed and the fire can actually conduct, but not until you're able to maintain a sense of internal cleanliness that leads to a basic sense of well being. That's how you know you're not absorbing everybody's trash. So when you reach a state, and I'm not talking ecstasy like I said in previous videos, I'm talking if you reach a state of basic well being, contentment in the moment where you know that all is well, even if it doesn't seem that way, or even if externally I'm in a kind of difficult situation, but it's not a life threatening crisis, that contentment can still be there. And from there, you're able to harness your aspiration, ignite the fire, observe yourself continuously as much as you can, and over time, surrender to the notion known as Ishvara, which in Sanskrit means the inner authority. So you can be religious and do this. This has no conflict with any of the monotheistic religions. In fact, you can call Ishvara Christ consciousness if you like. It is more or less similar, if not exactly the same. And if you don't think it's exactly the same, you can move from this inner authority into Christ consciousness according to the religion or any religion, because the religions also tell you surrender to the deity, surrender to the divine, surrender to God or goddess, as it were, or the Tao. So surrender doesn't mean capitulation. Surrender means being open and receptive. And that's as far as our discussion goes today. There's a lot to digest, but tune in next time where we're going to turn this around into a clearer explanation of how to get to the mental stance that combines these 3 elements of fire, self observation, and surrender to the inner authority. When this happens, you have created enough of a foundation to move into the proper progression of the subdivisions of the Yoga Sutras. And this is well before the last 3 subdivisions, which entail meditation. Meditation is the 7th stage of the 8-limbed yoga. And right now, we haven't entered the 3rd stage yet. But by the time you do reach meditation, you will be at a point where you can actually do it in a more comfortable manner, in a more effective manner, in a more advanced manner, because you have a proper foundation. This is what it's all about. So stay tuned, because next time we will get into the nitty-gritty of harnessing your life force, your senses, and channeling all of that with your newfound stance of consciousness into a state called concentration proper. And concentration proper is the practice that is usually mistaken for meditation. So we're spiraling. Each level is a higher level or harmonic or octave of the previous one. You see, the Yoga Sutras weren't made for special people. They were made for those with heart and determination and common sense. So you can do this. Well, that, let me bid you adieu. See you next time. Vegas out.